Yesterday, the summit of the heads of state and government of the European Union came to an end, where the leaders of the member states discussed several important issues, including war, migration, and competitiveness. I will be discussing these topics in the next half hour with Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yesterday, upon arriving at the summit, you mentioned 3 battles that need to be fought. First, the war in Ukraine, and then Ukrainian President Zelensky presented you with his victory plan. How was this received by the heads of state and government?
When it comes to the war in Ukraine, the European Union is divided into 2 groups, the others and us. That's how I would describe the situation. At some point, the stories will be written about how this came to be, but from the very beginning, Hungary has made it clear that we do not want to take part in the war efforts. Today, all other EU countries are involved in the war. Some speak of it more bluntly, some more diplomatically, but they are all essentially talking about fighting a war against Russia. They are not directly clashing with Russia because Ukraine is between them, and it's the Ukrainians who are fighting on the front lines, who are dying there, but in reality, the European Union is acting as a warring party. Hungary made it clear from the start that this is a flawed strategy, it's a miscalculation, and this war cannot be won. The Ukrainian-Russian conflict cannot be resolved on the battlefield, so instead of escalating the war, we need negotiations, agreements, diplomacy, and contact to try to bring an end to the war as soon as possible, so that as few people die as possible, Ukraine loses as little territory as possible, and so that we, Hungarians and Europeans in general, can return to a peaceful life. We shouldn't have to send billions of dollars and euros to the war, burning up that enormous amount of money, nor should we impose sanctions that ruin European trade, destroy the European energy system, or create a situation where energy prices suddenly skyrocket, driving massive inflation. We shouldn't make it so that the price of gas in the European economy is 4 or 5 times that of the American price, or that electricity in Europe is twice or 3 times as expensive as in America, because then our factories won't be able to sell their products and they won't be competitive. So let's not do any of that. This was Hungary's position, and we also said that this would end in defeat. Now we stand here, and the other 27 countries had to listen in shock to President Zelensky explaining his victory plan. But what has it been so far? We thought they were already following a victory plan, but it turns out they weren't. What existed as a plan until now has turned out to be the plan for defeat. Now they want to switch to a victory plan. We said, and I said it yesterday, that we are not participating in this. This is not our victory plan. And in our view, while we wish the Ukrainians well and hope they succeed, this victory plan cannot lead to victory. It can only lead to more loss. We had an exciting discussion about this, where we had to signal that we remain outside this war. We have not participated so far, and we will not participate in the future.
What are the chances or risks of the intensity of the fighting increasing or even widening? According to Bild's information, Zelensky also suggested, for example, that if the Russians advance again, say toward Kyiv, Ukraine could be just weeks away from developing a nuclear bomb.
I saw the reports in the press about this. What I personally heard from President Zelensky during this discussion did not convey that message to me. Of course, we communicate through translations, so there may be subtle differences that one doesn't pick up on. But it didn't seem to me during the negotiations that the Ukrainians seriously intend to develop themselves into a nuclear power, which is quite difficult to imagine anyway. But one should be cautious even of such a possibility. The mere severity of the situation is well demonstrated by the fact that such a real, non-existent, undisclosed, half-secret, or completely secret, or perhaps even non-existent Ukrainian plan can cause panic-like waves in European public opinion. Everyone feels that we are so close to the possibility that the war could suddenly explode across Europe. Everyone feels how close we are, which gives fertile ground for these kinds of half-truths. So we need to verify this further. Our services are working on clarifying whether Ukraine indeed has any plans to build nuclear weapons.
It is interesting that more and more politicians are talking about peace, but perhaps Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, expressed the Western position most accurately yesterday when he said that Ukraine should begin negotiations with Russia from a position of strength. So they see the path to negotiations differently than you do. How likely do you think it is that a consensus can be reached and negotiations might begin in the near future?
There's little room for speculation when it comes to war. Speculation can mislead a country. You need to start from the facts. Of course, negotiations should take place from a position of strength, but since the war began, the positions have shifted in favor of Russia and to the detriment of Ukraine. So it's a good idea to negotiate from a position of strength, but the problem is that we are weak. And now, with the victory plan, it's about how we will become strong. But in reality, we are losing the war. I enjoy these well-crafted sentences from political salons. Meanwhile, people are dying by the thousands on the front lines. Young men on both sides and on the Ukrainian side. The best of a nation is falling. And then we give advice that it's a good idea to negotiate from a position of strength. In my opinion, the good idea is not to fight. The good idea is to make peace, or at least have a ceasefire, and try to end the conflict with as few losses as possible and with the best possible prospects for the future. So I can say that all the other countries of the European Union have a war strategy, while Hungary has a peace strategy. Interestingly, the European People's Party is the one fueling the fire the most. Manfred Weber and his team are the most committed to the war. The European People's Party is ultimately a German party, backed by the CDU, the Christian Democrats, and surprisingly, they are the most committed to the war in the entire European political landscape.
Since you mentioned the European People's Party, EPP, this conflict between Budapest and Brussels escalated on a party political level this week. The EPP posted something on social media featuring you against a red background, with the caption saying, "It's time to go." This is the most openly they've said this, as the largest party family in the European Union. How do you interpret this shift, this step? What do you attribute it to? The war we've been discussing surely plays a part.
Yes, the war is certainly part of it. As I mentioned, Hungary's stance is not about continuing the war, and I even proposed that it's time for negotiations. It would be good if the German Chancellor and the French President, either on their own or on behalf of Europe, began talks with the Russians before the Americans step in. The EPP has a different position, and of course they are demanding my departure from Hungary and with it a change of government which is tied to the war. But there are many other factors as well. The European People's Party envisions a Europe that is bad for Hungarians, and we, my government and I, have been fighting against this for years. The EPP has certainly taken a new step. Most recently, in the European Parliament debate last week or 2 weeks ago, they announced their agenda. They said, this government should go and this party should come. That party, of course, belongs to the European People's Party, and they want this new party to replace the current government and take with it the policies Brussels doesn't like. And the new government should pursue policies that please Brussels, such as allowing migrants in, joining the war, accepting gender ideology, and dismantling the child protection system in Hungary. They also have many economic demands. Don't tax their multinational corporations, don't burden their banks. We are familiar with these things as this battle has been going on for years. The situation really is that Brussels wants to see a government here, appointed by them as a viceroy, instead of the current government. Well, the Hungarian people will decide that, but that's still far off. There's more than a year and a half to go. Instead of talking about campaigns, I would rather say, let's work and succeed in pursuing our policies, which differ from Brussels, both in the economy and in foreign policy. And that's the proper response. As a Petofi poem would say, Bach Fiddy, or something like that, just as in 1848 to 49, when the Germans tried to tell us what should happen in Hungary.
We will discuss economic policy shortly, but you also mentioned that this battle has been going on for years. What could be the reason for its recent escalation?
There are problems within the European Union, and those very problems present the greatest challenges where Hungary is offering different responses. So Hungary shouldn't be an issue on its own. With a population of 10 million, our national product is not the highest in the EU. We don't have the largest army, and we don't wield the greatest influence, so they could leave us alone. They could say, well, they're doing it this way, and we'll see in the end who does better. This could be a fair competition. The problem is that it turns out that what we're doing in Hungary is largely what the European people want to see in their own countries. Meanwhile, their own governments are doing the opposite. Today, the situation is that everyone in Europe is against migration. I might be exaggerating, and there may still be pro-migration forces, but outside of the governments, no one is advocating for it anymore. A normal person in Brussels or Europe wouldn't dare to do that. They would give half their arm for conditions similar to ours regarding migration. So, the fact that there is no migration crisis in our country because we don't let them in, while they are banging their heads against the wall trying to figure out how they were so unfortunate as to allow millions of migrants in, who they now don't know what to do with, and they just keep coming and coming. Hungary is an example for the European people against their own governments. Or we could ask, why is it that Hungary, which is far from the richest country in the EU, has families paying the least for electricity, gas, and utilities? Why is that, and why can't it be like that in their countries? Here we have this 10 million strong Hungary with its capabilities. And over there is Germany with 84 million people, and France with over 61 million, both with enormous industrial power. Why do people pay less in Hungary? People aren't stupid. They ask these questions. Why is it that their governments are knee-deep in war, while Hungary is on the side of peace, which the majority of Europeans also support? So I believe that Hungary, while currently alone, is a thorn in the side of European governments. I actually try to downplay this significance. I try to slip by and not provoke them, wanting only to be left alone to do our things the way that suits us best. But the leaders feel the challenge that this is not just about Hungary. It's about how European politics, economic policy, military policy, energy policy, and migration policy could all be done differently. And the biggest problem with us is that we are successful. If we look at the economy, we see Germany stagnating. Hungary is expected to see a 1.8% growth next year, while they talk about stagnation everywhere else. I could give 1,000 examples. Take migration, for instance. Why should a French or a German person be afraid to let their child out in the evening? Why is it that at a large community event, one has to be cautious about what's happening in the crowd? Why is crime increasing? Why are they living under the threat of terrorism? Meanwhile, in Hungary, none of this exists. So the truth is that, unwittingly, we pose a challenge to others, which I try to keep under the radar with more restrained behavior, because it's not in our interest to beat our chests and brag. It's in our interest to ensure we manage our lives the way we prefer. But that's how it is now, and the European People's Party has put everything on the line. They have taken a stance since we left them, because what they demanded from Hungary was untenable. Anyone who joins the EPP is clearly against the interests of current Hungarian society. They found a party that joined and now want to put them in power and push through the program that Hungary rejected because it would harm the people living here. This battle is ongoing. It's not just domestic politics, but also Hungarian domestic politics is taking place in Brussels. How does this escalating battle affect the country's maneuverability or sovereignty?
This question is particularly interesting because we've discussed several times over the past weeks that achieving economic and neutrality policies requires precisely this maneuverability or sovereignty.
Interestingly, the situation I've described in a negative light, that we challenge the poorly governed EU countries, also somehow increases our standing. The attacks directed at Hungary are certainly unpleasant. I could speak personally about this, but they are not good for the country either. Yet, they do enhance our authority. Last week, the Chancellor met with me in Berlin, and next week I will meet with the French President, so it is clearly visible that the fact we are doing things differently and successfully elevates Hungary's profile in the world of foreign policy. Moreover, the most important news yesterday was that Robert Fico has indeed returned after an attempt to eliminate him with the help of some pro-activist here. In due time, we will learn about the conspiracy background of this whole situation, but he survived and has returned in explosive form. Next week, there will also be a trilateral summit meeting between Serbia, Hungary, and Slovakia, focusing on migration. What I want to convey is that while the situation I described challenges Hungary, and while the Brussels officials want to delegate another government with another program here, it also increases our standing in the region and within the European Union. I believe that our influence is greater than what the size and actual economic military strength of the country would justify. Regarding the economy, we are getting ready for next year, shaping a plan that will allow us to gain momentum in the upcoming year and provide a significant boost to the Hungarian economy. There will be great surprise when the first quarter economic figures are released in 2015, especially if we launch the 21-point plan that the public will gradually become acquainted with. Additionally, there will be a national consultation, which I regard as very significant because it must lay the foundations for the new economic policy. Europe is stagnant. It sees that the world is changing and that it should adapt, but it either cannot or doesn't want to, or it simply fails to do so. In contrast, Hungary will soar because we can step forward in this competition by announcing and reinforcing this policy of economic neutrality through quick adaptation. Provided that the people support this through the national consultation, a new economic policy does face challenges, as it is difficult to gain momentum, requires a lot of work, and entails some risks. We should only embark on this if the people also support and accept that Hungary deserves to pursue its own path in economic policy.
When we talk about the three pillars related to the economic neutrality program, we see the significant political dimensions of this program and the concept of economic neutrality. However, if we also consider the consultation, it's worth looking at it from the perspective of people's everyday lives to understand the goals of these measures and when we might see their results.
There are two fundamental aspects. One we discussed is the war. If there is a war, then the plans we've forged here, which we also aim to shape through the national consultation, will remain in the drawer because a wartime economy does not require such economic policies. Beyond just praying and cheering for Donald Trump, I sincerely hope we can avoid getting involved in a war. We shouldn't have too many victory plans in brackets. The second foundation of our economic policy, or its precondition, is that we must protect the country from migration. In a country that is flooded with migrants, where refugee camps need to be established, and where people from different cultures must be allowed in, it is impossible to implement the economic policy we are preparing. Migration brings not only the dangers of terrorism and crime, but also stirs tensions and consumes a significant amount of money. For instance, we are currently being penalized by Brussels for not allowing migrants in, but that penalty is still much smaller than the financial burden we would have to bear if we let them in. Therefore, we must stay out of the war and maintain Hungary as a migration-free zone. This is the foundation of our economic policy. After that, of course, we can talk about wage increases, as the time has come for this, and the accumulated performance in the economy justifies it, as employers also say. Housing is expensive, and we need to make it more affordable. Therefore, we must create affordable housing conditions, particularly for young people. The time has also come to support families by doubling the child tax credit. With the Demjan Sandor plan, we can assist small and medium-sized enterprises, providing them with perspectives to advance and integrate them better into economic growth. Thus, from the perspective of everyday life, this new economic policy will visibly manifest itself if we can solidify support through the consultation. And next year, we will see a noticeable change in everyday life as well.
We have already discussed the need for a competitiveness turnaround in the European Union, and that everyone practically agrees on this issue, although they see different solutions. What is needed for Europe to regain its competitiveness, whether against China, the Far East, or the United States?
The most important point to emphasize is that it is not a lack of intellect. We are not facing an intellectual problem. Studies are continually emerging, and presentations are being made that realistically address the situation. There was a report by a former Italian prime minister known as the Draghi Report, which circulates in Europe and clearly speaks about the problems. Therefore, decision-makers cannot claim that they are facing an intellectually challenging task because these issues are already solved. They outline and discuss what should be done, but they cannot implement it. There are many reasons why the West cannot implement these solutions, but to be honest, I am less interested in that. I am much more concerned about whether we, as Hungarians, can implement these solutions. I believe we can achieve what these studies and analyses about competitiveness propose. The first and most important thing is that you cannot compete when you are paying 3 to 4 times higher energy prices than your competitors. That competition is doomed. Don't even enter it. You've already lost. You cannot compete with an American company when its electricity or gas bill is 4 to 5 times lower than yours. There is no company in Europe that can manage that. The second issue is that you cannot withstand high taxes. In the West, taxes are being increased. If you burden companies, businesses, and people's incomes with taxes, you will lose competitiveness. Taxes need to be reduced. Besides us, hardly anyone in the West has reduced taxes in recent times. I believe we can accomplish all this, and we have put together a plan. In 2010, when we took over governance, if I may phrase it this way, a different Hungary has emerged since then in terms of capital, entrepreneurs, families, financial situations, and savings. Of course, we are plagued by various problems, but Hungary set out on a path in 2010. The situation is now different in that a scenario has developed globally that was not foreseen in 2010. Europe's competitiveness has decreased due to events of the past decade, while that of America and China has improved. Europe has responded to this situation with a strategy of closing itself off, blockading and imposing protective tariffs, essentially adopting a porcupine posture. This is bad. If we also adopt this porcupine stance and close our eyes to reality, burying our heads in the sand instead of competing, we fail to understand why others are better. We need to identify where their advantages lie, bring them into our own reforms, and put ourselves in a better position. Therefore, if we do not compete but instead isolate ourselves, we will live increasingly worse. That is why the essence of Hungarian policy is that whatever we call connectivity or economic neutrality, we need to trade and compete with everyone. We must participate in every international company that is competitive, collaborate, and cooperate to ensure that Hungary also benefits from the significant economic gains generated globally.